The young Mao had left home for the big city when he was 17 years old, and he'd cut off his pigtail, which was punishable by death, and he'd gone with young people hiking all over the country, climbing mountains and being health conscious, like all the other young people were caught up doing all over the world after the Great War. And Mao's friends had believed that China, if given the chance, could rule itself. Mao had gone to Beijing, Peking, and gotten a job at the university working in the library, where rich Chinese students would make fun of him. And Mao started his political activism when Sun Yat-sen was overthrown. The Chinese were treated as inferiors by Westerners who would use them as coolie labor, and the colonizers, quote, lived in foreign-style mansions surrounded by idyllic parks and racecourses. They entertained themselves with their own orchestras, ballet companies, and movie houses, close quote. The White-Boned Demon, a biography of Madame Mao Zedong by Ross Terrell, New York, William Morrow and Company, 1984, page 96. When Mao had gone to school as a young man, the city was dominated by the British and the French, and the local government was corrupt. Officials often cooperated with gangsters with whom kidnapping was a common form of extortion. My mother was too lively for the restrictions of being adequately guarded and was kidnapped twice. Fortunately, the gangsters rarely harmed their captives, nor did they demand exorbitant ransom. The payments were made with police connivance. We children suffered terrible shock when our mother was taken. I hated gangsterism and blamed it on the foreigners. Escape from Red China by Robert Lowe, as told to Humphrey Evans, New York, Coward McCon, 1962, page 17. During the Japanese occupation of Shanghai, the young communists had worked very hard to bring about the revolution, and the communists hiding in the mountains with Mao's growing army were learning to be soldiers and were making their own uniforms and were all comrades instead of the British division of officers being separate from the enlisted men. And the women were comrades too, and were allowed to fight and work alongside the Chinese men. Mao's comrades were finally given enough guns from America that they could fight Chiang Kai-shek and his ruthless blue shirts, who would come to chase the communists around before Mao was given some real guns. So America had evened up the fight and knew that Mao would happily do battle with the Japanese while Chiang Kai-shek had not been getting the job done. When Mao started his People's Republic of China, the British left for Southeast Asia to make trouble for the French, while the Chinese communists were still doing shu fu, or to convince by talk. After Mao was given enough real ammunition to come out of the hills to drive out the Japanese, ugly rumors began to appear about Mao, but they were so outrageous that people didn't believe any of the bad stories about their greatly loved leader, and the Chinese believed that the cruel lies about Mao were being spread by foreigners trying to win back China for themselves. The Korean Kim's great leader idea would be modeled after Mao's success, while the Russian reliance on individual Soviets was failing, and Kim Il-sung turned his national communism into a cult of personality. But without help from Russia during the Vietnam War, North Korea quickly slid into poverty. Somewhere along the line, somebody gave nuclear weapons technology to North Korea, hoping they'd use it against Russia, while the North Koreans only wanted to use it against Japan. The West had wanted to open China for business, but could not help them with their opium problem, and the Chinese thought opium had been thrust upon them as a Trojan horse. And in 1874, the Japanese moved into China, and by 1900, Britain controlled 80% of world trade with China, followed by Germany, France, and then Russia. The Japanese had been invited in by the British to manage factories and to keep the coolie labor in line. And the Chinese boxers rebelled against these foreign devils by trying to throw out all the foreigners in 1900, but the foreign powers banded together to send troops to defeat both the Chinese Boxers and the Japanese, since Westerners had a hard time telling them apart. While the Boxers were being crushed by foreign troops, the British sent more reinforcements into China, and they took thousands of Chinese students back with them to study in England. The Russian Tsar Nicholas II had built the Trans-Siberian Railroad that ran all the way from Moscow to the port of Vladivostok, and China had tracks running right up to the Trans-Siberian Railroad at the border, where the gauge needed to be changed for security reasons. Russian train cars were more narrow than the Chinese, so the entire body of a train car had to be lifted onto a different set of wheels before the train could proceed, and the switchover gave the Chinese time to inspect the freight on board Russian trains. The Chinese were happy that Russia owned Port Arthur because it helped to keep out the British as well as the Japanese, and Japan captured Port Arthur by force of arms in 1905 in a sneak attack, sinking the Russian fleet without warning, and the British had advised Russia to stay out of Manchuria and China and Tibet. When America put forth a protest over the military action against the Boxers, President McKinley was assassinated, and the following year Britain signed a pact with Japan that if war was declared by anyone on either Britain or Japan, the other would come to do battle for their partner. But if either went to war on their own first, the unattacked partner would not have to participate. The Boer War had just cost the Crown £220 million, and as soon as the 1902 Jap-Brit Pact was signed, the King and Queen of Serbia were assassinated, and the year after that, the Wright brothers flew for the first time in America. Britain celebrated Empire Day on the 24th of May in 1904, as soon as the Japanese had been enticed to go to war with Russia, starting with the surprise attack on the Russian fleet on the 8th of February in 1904 while it was parked at Port Arthur. And it would be within 2 years that the Royal Navy launched their first dreadnought battleship, and Japan was allowed to stay in Korea after the surprise attack on Russia. After the Great War, Germany's possessions in the Shantung province were taken away in 1919 and given to Japan instead of to Britain, and Shantung was all the land between Shanghai and Peking. Beijing. Shanghai and Beijing, Peking. The Chinese in Shantung preferred the Germans to the Japanese, so they asked the Russians to help them after America had refused, and in 1928, Mao was given ammo and war material by the Russians, who were still smarting from the Japanese, having sunk their navy in 1904, and Mao would go forth in the name of communism to wipe out all the landlords and decadent rich people in Shanghai who had sold China out to the British and their Japanese concubines. FDR called the Arcadia Conference in Washington, D.C., 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor suffered a sneak attack on the 7th of December in 1941, and it was at Arcadia that FDR proclaimed that America would not allow any of the Allies to settle for a separate peace, and he had called it the Declaration by the United Nations. Arcadia established a Europe First policy, while Churchill wanted a, quote, unified America, British, Dutch, Australian command in the Pacific theater that turned out to be a very bad idea. And the Americans would begin winning the war against Japan as soon as they stopped using information supplied by the British, claiming to have gotten their information from quote-unquote broken codes they were calling Magic Purple. The war in the Pacific finally turned in favor of the Americans when a genius young signalman came up with the idea of reporting over his radio that the island of Midway had almost run out of fresh water, and the Japanese reported that message on a frequency other than the Magic Purple channel, and the young signalman figured out that the British were not telling the truth about their code breaking. As soon as the Americans stopped using the British magic purple intelligence, they began to win battles, and there would be no more sneak attacks or ambushes coming from the Japanese Navy, except for one, the Indianapolis. Britain had been forced to renounce its alliance with Japan after the Great War, so they had replaced it with naval treaties in 1922, 1930, 1932, and 1936. And when the 1930 treaty was signed, the Japanese military had objected to limits imposed on building even more warships, so some Japanese naval officers killed Japan's prime minister in 1930, along with an important executive of Mitsui, who was manufacturing Golden Bat cigarettes spiked with opium to send into China for the upcoming invasion. An unfulfilled part of the coup against the civilian government of Japan had included killing Charlie Chaplin, who was visiting Japan at the time, and the conspirators were hoping that America would declare war on Japan because of that murder plot in 1930, but the military had not yet been ready. The young naval officers were arrested, and while they were awaiting a courts-martial and certain execution for the murders, a petition arrived, signed in blood by 350,000 Japanese, along with 11 severed fingers from Japanese patriots asking to take their place. The Communist May 4th movement in 1923 had completely shut down Shanghai with labor strikes, and Chiang Kai-shek had formed an army with the help of his British advisors to root out the Russian Jew communists, spurring on the May 4th agitators, and Shek sent troops into Shanghai in April of 1927. After killing all the communists he could find in Shanghai, Shek went after the rest of them in the countryside, and that's when Mao took his communist friends on the long march into the mountains, and they walked 6,000 miles in 1 year, and 80% of them died along the way. The Japanese attacked China in 1931, fanning out over the mainland and seizing railroads and road crossings and government buildings, and the Russians sent munitions to help Mao. The Japanese dropped bombs on Taiwan, where the British were headquartered, and the Japanese Navy fired on Shandong, from warships parked in the Yellow Sea, and while many foreign devils were dying in China, the USS Augusta would be parked in the harbor at Shanghai on the Huangpu River in the summer of 1937, when an anti-aircraft shell killed an American seaman from Louisiana who became the first casualty of World War II. The USS Augusta became the U.S. flagship for FDR and then for President Truman, and it would be aboard the Augusta that Patton prepared for Operation Torch, and she would carry Bradley to the Normandy beaches on D-Day, and for Dragoon, the Augusta fired over 700 rounds of 203mm shells on German forts that quickly surrendered. In November of 1944, the Augusta was in Philadelphia being refitted when she suffered a mysterious explosion that killed 3 shipyard workers and 4 Navy men, and the Augusta would be stripped and modified for participation in Operation Magic Carpet that would bring the troops home from Europe at the end of Hitler's war, a war that had begun in earnest in December of 1937 as Japan invaded and then raped China under color of the Marco Polo Bridge incident. The Augusta had sailed into Yokohama Harbor on the 4th of June in 1934 to show the flag, and had been sailing back and forth between China and Japan until the Marco Polo Bridge incident on the 7th of July in 1937, and FDR ordered the Augusta to sail to Vladivostok on the 24th of July, accompanied by 4 destroyers, and the captain and the crew were lavishly entertained by the Russians, and it had been the first time a U.S. naval vessel had visited Vladivostok since 1922. Admiral Harry Yarnell, had skirted a typhoon to reach Vladivostok, and he went right through another on the return trip, with the Augusta managing 30-degree rolls before reaching the Huangpu River on the 14th of August, and they had passed many Japanese ships in Shanghai harbor, principally light cruisers and destroyers, and the sailor would be killed a week later amidships on the well deck on the 20th of August by a Chinese anti-aircraft shell that wounded 18 others. On the 12th of December in 1937, Japan sunk the U.S. Panay upriver from Shanghai that had been evacuating Americans, and they also sank 3 Standard Oil Company tankers. And FDR wanted to blockade oil to Japan, but Britain refused to join the embargo, and FDR had already been embargoing scrap iron to Japan, being used by them to build ships. Admiral Yarnell had gone to great lengths in 1932 to prove to the Navy that the fleet at Pearl Harbor was vulnerable, because he had been in the American delegation at the London Naval Conference of 1930. But the Navy dismissed his warnings, and all that was achieved had been the New York Times printing his report in the newspaper. The Japanese claimed that the sinking of the Panay was a mistake, and that the American flags painted on the side of the Panay had not been visible, but the British wanted FDR to know that the attack had been intentional, and they gave him information from the secret Japanese Navy codes intercepted from radio traffic that the British said they were reading with their magic purple devices. After the Panay incident, the code breaking from the British would never again produce any useful information except for diplomatic traffic, and they never again offered any gleaned military information, and even the diplomatic chatter hadn't been accurate from the very beginning. Japan had most of China under its restraint after 1934, and Chiang Kai-shek made friends temporarily with the Communists in order to fight the Japanese, but that changed in 1941 when the British made their support conditional. And these 3 groups would continue to fight each other in China until Mao emerged the winner after the war. The British had been using their stronghold of Burma to support Chiang Kai-shek, and the Americans had gone along with it until the corruption of Shek's associates disgusted FDR, as most of them were hoarding weapons and supplies to fight Mao's communists instead of fighting the Japanese. As intelligence reports from the British proved to be not just unreliable but downright dangerous, the American sailor on Midway Island sent out his fake message that the water purification system had broken down and that the island would soon be out of fresh water, and when the Japanese forwarded the message about the Americans' plight on Midway, the Americans were able to learn the Japanese code word for Midway Island, and they learned they were the target of a major attack, and Admiral Nimitz was able to send reinforcements to Midway, including the Yorktown, and the Battle of Midway would be the turning point in the Pacific War. The Yorktown had taken a direct hit by a torpedo bomber in the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the Japanese believed that she had been sunk, but the Americans had towed the Yorktown to Pearl Harbor, and they thought it would need at least 90 days to repair. But at Pearl Harbor they decided it would take 2 weeks, and the repairs were done in 48 hours, although some versions said 72 hours, and the final work was accomplished while the Yorktown was steaming towards Midway in June of 1942, where it would help sink 4 Japanese carriers and tilt the balance of power in the Pacific towards the Americans. The Yorktown was named after the final battle of the War of American Independence, where the British had been forced to surrender on the 19th of October in 1781, and malaria had taken out half of the British army, and George Washington had been fighting alongside the French, and 1/3 of the American soldiers had been German-speaking Germans. To get the Yorktown seaworthy again and back to Midway Island, it had taken 1,400 men working around the clock, and they had enacted periodic blackouts on the entire island of Hawaii to make enough power available for the repair work on the Yorktown, and those men would not have been able to achieve that miracle had they not been practicing repairing ships after the attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months before. Going on a ship over the massive waters, there has often been the statement that there's nothing to see but water. There is so much to see. A pod of whales following close behind the fantail, waiting for the ship to disperse garbage to feed on along with sharks. There is a lot of activity in the waters with turtles, and just the amazement of the wave action with the collision of cross waves. The nights on the water is really great, and the electric eel with its shimmer and the stars at night are of a most magnificent field of guidance. The ocean is magnificent. I enjoyed the dark hours the most in the transporting of the unknown destination for the troops. The dark nights with no moon, the waves and the bow of the ship in rhythm in the breaking of the waters. There was no reflection from the waves with no moon, and the only observation was to look directly over the railings. Looking toward the skies with the many billions of stars, one could only be in awe of where we are in the universe. Looking out over the ocean with many shades of what we call neon, including greens, blues, oranges, pinks, and all streaked together in the speed, in any direction and as far as the naked eye could see, creating sensational experiences of the size of the ocean that one cannot experience on his own in a smaller rig. Seeing the small fish neon by the thousands, cutting in and out of the waves as they washed away from the closeness of the ship, the combined effect gave one an awesome feeling of seeing something that no one else ever sees. You are in your own vastness of the universe. The moonlit nights were in an expression of its own, in a different visualization, sending its lights, which exposed the huge swells in the Pacific Ocean, which is different from the Atlantic Ocean. The Pacific Ocean in the calm of the sea at sunset, and the shades of darkness there is often must be where you can see this at the right time, what is referred to as the emerald green, so beyond one's ability to describe. The ocean by the equator at the dawn and twilight have magnificent shades of color and artistic features, like that of the mountains of Colorado. The light from the moon gives the swells of the Pacific Ocean a crested view of green, and folded into the array of dark blues and whites in the swells, which is amazing that it is so quiet. All of this, and the rhythm of the ship, is an amazing experience. The Life and Stories of Richard Dick Grader by Richard Grader, Victor, Colorado native, instantpublisher.com, 2009, page 140 and 41. Churchill had promised at the Arcadia Conference that as soon as Germany was defeated, the British would help the Americans to fight the Japanese. But after seeing the Normandy theater play itself out, the Americans knew it was better to just drop the bomb. At the Casablanca Conference, FDR compromised with Churchill about invading Italy before France, and the deal was that Churchill promised in exchange that the British would supply China through Burma, but those supplies weren't getting through because Chiang Kai-shek was selling the supplies on the black market while his own soldiers starved and froze on the battlefield, and then the Japanese cut the British supply line from Burma. The American general, Vinegar Joe Stilwell, had been a thorn in the side of the British who were advising Scheck, so Scheck asked FDR to remove Stilwell, and in response, FDR sent Stilwell to meet Mao. By 1941, the Chinese were seriously starving, and Stilwell spoke fluent Mandarin Chinese, and Mao had the support of all the starving people in China. Mao was being given advice from Russia on how to help the poor starving Chinese build communism, and Russia would have been seriously stressed in fighting both Germany and Japan, so the Russians kept a low profile in allowing the Americans to help Mao. Because Mao's communists were considered rebels, the Americans called their meeting with Mao the Dixie Mission, and Japan had not attacked Russia, primarily because they knew Russia was a friend of America. The Japanese rules of war relied on sneak attacks, and if Russia had been attacked before Pearl Harbor, the Americans would have quarantined Japan. In 1931, hundreds of thousands of Chinese had been killed as thousands of Japanese soldiers marched through China, and the Chinese had fought back with a handful of rickety planes given them by the Italians, the Germans, the British, and the Americans, and the dead and the maimed in Nanking were incalculable when the Japanese raped China in December of 1937. The Japanese sank another American gunboat, and the U.S. loaned China $25 million to fight the Japanese, and the Russians, helped by sending tanks, and aid came into China from all around the world, over the Silk Road from Turkey, and through the port of Rangoon up over the Burma Road that had been built by the British using coolie labor so they could funnel opium from India into China. After 2 million Chinese were killed, Japan was still in occupation of half of China, and 3 million Chinese soldiers would die during Hitler's war along with 8 million civilians, and 23 million Russians would be killed, half of them soldiers, and 2 million Japanese soldiers and 3 million Japanese civilians would die. And when the war was over, there would be no going back to the previous politics that had caused such destruction in the first place, and both Russia and China embraced communism instead of whatever had gone wrong with the world that had brought on Hitler's war, while MacArthur would bring democracy to Japan. The guns that the Americans had given Mao to fight the Japanese would be used by Mao against Chiang Kai-shek and his little army of blue shirts, and Mao had the support of the peasants, which was just about everyone in China. America had sympathy for the Chinese mostly because so many Chinese had come over to build railroads in America, and had blended for the most part, interacting with Americans while the Japanese tended to keep to themselves. Britain's pact with Japan in 1902 had required Japan to attack Pearl Harbor if Britain could prove that America was giving aid to Germany after the British declaration of war against Hitler on the 3rd of September in 1939. The pact that British had made with Japan had evolved into meaning that the Japanese were required by their ongoing alliance with Britain to assist in bringing America to the peace table by any means necessary, with the agreement that if either Britain or Japan were attacked by more than one nation, the one not attacked would step in to arrange a peace under threat of having to face the combined might of the two world empires, Britain and Japan. To make matters worse, FDR had been sending aid to China because of the Japanese invasion of 1931, and Japan was claiming that the British were required to step in to stop that American aid to the Chinese, and FDR answered that any protest that giving support to China was a violation of American neutrality would be met with his assertion that the war Japan was inflicting upon China was not a legally declared war. The Americans had forced Britain to disavow their alliance with Japan in 1923, but that dissolution had been done under duress, and the Japanese High Command knew that the British didn't really mean it, since, after all, they were both empires led by royal families appointed by the deity itself, and that uncontestable reality superseded anything America or anyone else had to say about the matter. America had been helping Germany by doing business with Germans on a rather large scale in 1939, and the understanding that Britain had with Japan in the more than one nation clause had actually first been triggered when Italy joined with France in Ethiopia in 1935, their laughable attempt to counter the British embargo against Italy, and when Russia moved into Poland on the 17th of September in 1939. The more than one nation clause demanded action because America had also been doing business with Russia. It had all seemed so clear and reasonable to the British, and when Stalin made his non-aggression pact with Hitler on the 23rd of August in 1939, the move into Poland 2 weeks later certainly qualified as an attack by more than one nation. Thus, Japan had no choice but to attack Pearl Harbor unless they wanted to dispense with their long-standing friendship with Britain, something the Japanese considered unthinkable. To uphold their part of the bargain, in helping the British bring Germany and Russia to the bargaining table, and because America was friendly to both Germany and Russia, the Japanese saw it as their clear duty to commit a police action against America at Pearl Harbor to help their British friends who were now at war with Germany and its quasi-ally Russia. The 1902 pact that had appealed to the Japanese because it stated that if Japan went to war and a third power entered the fight against Japan, then Britain would come to the aid of the Japanese, and it had been intended to prevent any third power from intervening in a war Japan wanted to force upon their favorite target, Russia. The fallout was that if Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the British were not required to help Japan fight America, but if America had attacked Japan first, then Britain would have been required to go to war with America, and together with Japan's military might, and after France and Poland had been taken out, Britain and Japan could have easily conquered America as long as Hitler was on board with the plan, and that was to be the penalty imposed upon America if the U.S. refused to support Britain's great game against Russia, or at least have agreed to stay out of the way. The Japanese had sent a delegation to America to negotiate a settlement between Poland, Britain, France, and Germany, Russia, and if America wanted to refuse this overture to an easy early settlement against Germany and Russia, then the world would learn about the phone call from Churchill warning FDR about the imminent attack on Pearl Harbor that had been tape recorded for posterity's sake because the British were doing everything by the book and by treaty and by maritime law. With America's declaration of war against Japan on the 8th of December in 1941, followed by war with Germany and Italy on the 11th of December, the U.S. Coast Guard was given over to the control of the U.S. Navy so they could keep the Royal Navy away from America's shores. Admiral Nimitz would stop the Japanese at Midway after telling some of his diligent American naval officers that he had had a hinky feeling the day of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and so he'd sent 4 of America's aircraft carriers from Pearl Harbor out to sea that day, in pure good luck, just to blow some dust off their decks that morning on the day of infamy, December 7th, 1941. Churchill had also been insisting that the Japanese were going to attack Russia, egging FDR on to begin military action against Japan, but FDR had kept his powder dry and even refused Admiral Yarnell's demand that more warships be sent to China in the summer of 1937, specifically Yarnell's request for a division of heavy cruisers, but FDR had refused him the escalation. Churchill had warned FDR for many months that Japan was going to attack Russia, and he was fervent and incisive about that, but FDR always brushed him off with the same detached politeness given to anyone who drank as much as Churchill. The Korean peasants had rioted against the Japanese in Korea in 1882 and had chased them into the sea, where they'd been rescued by the British ship HMS Flying Fish. The Qings in China sent 4,500 troops to help the Koreans, so the Japanese sent 4 warships and a battalion of troops, and a treaty was signed before things got out of hand that allowed the Japanese to keep some bases in Manchuria, and Chinese advisors were allowed to stay in Korea. The Japanese tried to take over Korea again 2 years later in 1884, but were beaten back by the Chinese, and the following year Japan sent 7 warships and 2 battalions of soldiers, and another treaty was signed, but this time both sides were required to remove their troops from Korea. The Manchu in China had come from what was originally the Jin dynasty, who had come from Manchuria, and Mao would put an end to the ineffective Manchu, who were unable to control the flood of opium coming into China, and the Jin dynasty had lasted for 100 years until the Mongols conquered them. The Manchu came back in 1644 after the Mings had managed to kick out the Mongols, and the Manchu were now called Qings, and they would complete the Great Wall of China that the Mings had fortified to keep out the Mongols, and the Qings would finish the Great Wall to keep out both the Mongols and the Mings. Japan relied on soybeans being grown by Korean peasants who regularly revolted against the Korean king for lower taxes and more land of their own. And in 1889, a poor soybean harvest caused the Korean king to stop exports to Japan. In 1889, a poor soybean harvest caused the Korean king to stop exports to Japan to keep Korea itself from starving, and when the peasants rose up again 4 years later in 1893, the Japanese landed 6,000 troops in Incheon. The Qing sent 1,500 soldiers and made an agreement with the peasants that lowered their taxes and awarded them more land if only they agreed to go back to the soybean fields, so the Korean king could continue to collect taxes on soybeans being sold to Japan. Many Korean landowners did not cooperate with the agreement, and the peasants revolted again, and the Korean king called the Chinese Qings in 1894 to send 2,800 soldiers to put down the peasant uprising, and the Japanese landed 8,000 troops and captured the Korean king. The Japanese military was being trained by the British, and Japan had ordered 2 battleships being built for them in England, and the Korean peasants were fighting with bows and arrows, and with spears and swords and an occasional antique musket. The Japanese brought with them their first Maxim machine gun knockoffs, and the Maxim machine gun could shoot as much as 40 men with rifles and had a range of 2.5 miles. The Qings had been able to negotiate with the Japanese over Korea for so many years that they did not respond strongly enough this time, and they had never seen a machine gun, and Korea became littered with mutilated corpses because the Japanese had some weird thing about dismembering the dead. The Qings thought the Japanese would return back to Japan again after the Korean peasants left alive had gone back home to grow more soybeans. But this time the Japanese stayed, and more troops came from Japan and steamrolled over the Chinese Qings, who lost Taiwan to the Japanese and were so weakened by the Sino-Japanese War that the rest of the world were able to take over China and partition it among themselves. By 1900, the Chinese peasants had enough of the foreigners and rose up in the Boxer Rebellion, and troops arrived from all over the different Western countries to quell the Boxers, who were so named because they were kung fu fighters, and that was close enough to the Western form of boxing to be given that name. Japan sent 20,000 troops to China to quash the Boxers, while the Boxers were also fighting the Chinese government, who were trying to negotiate with the Western powers in hopes they would help keep Japan off the mainland. China offered to pay all the foreigners to put down the Boxers if only they agreed that Japan was not allowed into China. And China offered to make payments on the deal until 1940, and after the Boxer Rebellion was crushed, Britain made their alliance with Japan in 1902, and the Japanese went home to build up their military for the next round. After the Chinese had lost the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, the Koreans had turned to Russia for help getting rid of the Japanese. And the Korean king had asked the Russians to build a railroad, and it was under construction when the Boxers rose up, and Russia sent a couple 100,000 soldiers into Manchuria to protect their railroads that were being built as a joint Chinese-Russian venture, and in February of 1904, the Japanese attacked the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, using torpedo boats after giving the Tsar a 3-hour warning, and 2 months later the British press showed up in force. The British had been sharing telegraph and radio messages with Japan that the British were intercepting from the Russians, and the Japanese knew they had to attack the Russian fleet before Russia completed its Trans-Siberian Railway that would be able to quickly bring troops to help the Koreans. And when the Russian fleet of the Pacific was destroyed, the Tsar dispatched the Baltic fleet to Manchuria, but the British denied them the use of the Suez Canal, and the Russians had to sail around the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of Africa. When the Russian Baltic fleet finally arrived in Korea, the Japanese were waiting for them, and out of 38 Russian ships, only 3 made it into port, and the Russians had burned 500,000 tons of coal getting there. The French made the excuse that Britain had threatened France with war if they helped their Russian friends at Port Arthur, and Britain had threatened Russia with war if they used the Suez Canal. But perhaps that's what the Crown had really wanted the whole time. And after the Russian fleet was laid waste in the sneak attack, the British sent the Japanese a lock of Admiral Nelson's hair, and Nelson had been Britain's favorite old Navy hero who had been prone to seasickness. The Japanese killed 50,000 Russians, and the Russians killed 60,000 Japanese in the War of 1905, and 20,000 Chinese died, and the dead Koreans remained uncounted. And the Japanese took over the Sakhalin Islands, and Teddy Roosevelt stepped in to broker a truce. The Japanese got Korea and the Sakhalin Islands, but would lose both after Hitler's war. And the Russians were not forced to pay war reparations to Japan in 1905, and the people of Japan rioted over that, claiming that the easy terms for Russia was because of racism. The British renewed their alliance with Japan in 1905 and again in 1911 because Japan's full-throttle buildup of their military threatened the British presence in India. So Britain agreed to leave Korea to the mercy of Japan if the Japanese agreed to leave India alone to the British, and Britain sold an enormous amount of military equipment and technology to Japan in time for the Great War. The deal had included the agreement that the Japanese would protect British ships in the Mediterranean from the Germans, and the Great War would be fought to protect Britain's sea lanes to their poppy plantations in India. The Qing Chinese banned poppy growing again in 1908, and they planned to get rid of all opium in China by 1917, but they excluded the Dowager Empress because she was already addicted. And the British took over 3 states in Siam in 1909, and the English king was declared Emperor of India in 1911, and the Germans sent a gunboat to Agadir. The Black Dragon gang from Japan. The Black Dragon gang from Japan participated in the overthrow of the Qing dynasty in October of 1911, and by the time of Hitler's war, the Japanese had invented an ingenious fighter airplane called the Zero that had an aluminum shell and was extremely maneuverable, but only at slow speed, so the Zero was unable to outfly the Americans and would be used primarily for suicide missions. America had remitted their share of the Boxer Rebellion debt in 1908 towards scholarships for Chinese students to come to study in America, and the Americans used the rest of it to build a university in Beijing, and Lenin had forgiven his portion of the debt in 1918 in exchange for a little friendship, while the British used their due allotment to build a railroad in China, and the French share went towards opening a bank. China's debt from the Boxer Uprising had almost been wiped out by 1927 and had gone a long way towards modernizing China, and Sun Yat-sen would have been a good and decent leader for China, but he'd been unable to control the military, who were rampaging around China collecting taxes. And when they murdered Sun Yat-sen in 1925, Chiang Kai-shek was put in his place, and the young Mao rose to the occasion. Because Churchill had been elected out of office back home in the summer of 1945, right in the middle of the conference at Potsdam, Stalin had come in a hopeful state, and because occupying armies trumped paperwork, the only item on the agenda at Potsdam worth discussion was the upcoming unconditional surrender of Japan. Russia had wanted to do some serious wartime action in the direction of the Japanese islands, having been prevented earlier by agreements with the Allies, so America dropped the bomb on Japan to save the Japanese from a far worse fate at the hands of the Red Army, and Russia declared war on Japan 2 days later. The U.S. dropped the second bomb on day 3 just to give the Russians pause, which it did. Because FDR had not survived the end of the war, only the Big Two were able to attend the Potsdam Conference in August of 1945, to which France tagged along because Britain insisted that France be a fourth wheel at the new Security Council in order to ensure that a vote among the major powers would always be deadlocked, instead of allowing America and Russia to always hold sway over Britain. If the British wanted to include France, then the U.S. demanded that China be given a seat on the Security Council, even though they were in the middle of a civil war.